Donald Trump. You've seen the headlines, you've heard the name. For decades, he's been a constant presence in our lives. But behind that media storm is a man of, believe it or not, some seriously rigid habits, and a brand that was masterfully built over years. So in this explainer, we're going to look past the politics and really try to understand the methods and the mindset behind it all. Let's dive in.
And we're going to start in a pretty unusual place, the presidential bedroom. According to people who worked in the White House, this is one of the very first things Donald Trump would reach for in the morning, after getting his usual 4 hours of sleep. 2 full containers of white Tic Tacs and 1 that's half full. It's such a specific, kind of weird ritual, right? And trust me, it's just the beginning.
And all this specificity, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What can these personal, almost trivial little habits tell us about a much bigger approach to power and leadership? Well, it turns out they reveal a whole lot.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain on his daily routine in the White House. This is a place that, normally runs like a Swiss watch. But Trump's approach, it was anything but normal.
So the day kicks off around 5 a.m. After the Tic Tacs, breakfast is an ice-cold Diet Coke. Then it's time to check the news. But not from some formal intelligence briefing. Nope. It comes from a Lululemon bag delivered by an aide that some people called his human printer, and it's just filled with positive news clips and flattering articles. This is also when he would often jump on Truth Social, firing off posts that could literally set the agenda for the entire day.
And this really sets the tone for a huge contrast. I mean, most presidencies are built on these rigid, predictable schedules full of detailed briefings. But Trump's workday was dominated by something he called executive time. And what that really meant was unstructured time. Time for phone calls, watching TV, and impromptu meetings. His own former chief of staff basically described it as just winging it to see what the day would bring.
But here's the thing. Inside that unstructured professional life, his personal rules were absolutely non-negotiable. He had this deep distrust for intelligence agencies, and he demanded that his briefings be oral and just give him the nuggets. He's a famous germaphobe, so aides had to have Purell on them at all times. And his diet, all that fast food, it's not just about the taste. He has this long-held belief that the big chains are just cleaner. Even the soap in the White House, Irish Spring, was strictly regulated. Housekeepers were told never to throw away a bar, no matter how tiny the sliver was.
So, you might be asking yourself, where does this bizarre mix of personal rigidity and professional chaos even come from? Well, to get the what, you have to go all the way back to the why, and that starts with his upbringing.
This right here, this was the core philosophy passed down from his father, Fred Trump, who was a really successful and, by all accounts, ruthless real estate developer. Don't be weak. Be a killer. This wasn't just fatherly advice. It was a command, and it became the central rule that would define his son's whole approach to life.
As a kid, he was apparently pretty aggressive, always stirring up trouble. So at 13, his dad sent him off to the New York Military Academy. You'd think that would break him, but instead, he absolutely thrived in that tough, competitive world. He graduated as a captain, went to Wharton, and then took over the family business. But a really defining moment was waiting just around the corner.
In 1973, the Department of Justice hit the Trump Organization with a massive lawsuit for racial discrimination in their housing. Now, most lawyers told him to just settle it quietly, but he took the advice of the infamous attorney Roy Cohn and instead countersued the government for $100 million. He did eventually have to settle, but, and this is the key part, he did it without ever admitting he did anything wrong. This became his lifelong playbook. Never, ever apologize, never admit a mistake, and always, always fight back harder.
So, armed with this killer instinct, Trump turned his focus from his dad's business in the outer boroughs to the big, glittering prize, Manhattan. And his goal wasn't just to build buildings, it was to build a brand.
And he was pretty open about his strategy. In his own words, he would play to people's fantasies. He just instinctively understood that people are drawn to things that are the biggest, the greatest, the most spectacular. He wasn't just selling condos, he was selling this larger-than-life story, a fantasy of ultimate success.
He started licensing his name, and pretty soon, it was his most valuable asset. All of a sudden, you had the Trump Shuttle, an airline that promised you the most luxurious flight imaginable.
Then came Trump Steaks, which you could actually buy through the Sharper Image. They were of course billed as the world's greatest.
And of course, Trump Vodka. The bottle was designed to look like a skyscraper, and the slogan was "Success Distilled." Now, a lot of these businesses actually failed. But you know what?
It almost didn't matter. The point was to make the name Trump mean opulence and success. But the real game changer, the ultimate branding machine, was television. The Apprentice beamed his persona into millions of homes every single week, cementing this idea of him as the tough, decisive, billionaire boss. It totally rejuvenated his image and made "You're fired" a national catchphrase.
So the brand is established, he's a household name, and he becomes an absolute master at using the media to keep that flame alive. He learned very early on how to command the spotlight. I mean, just look at this number, 87. What is that? That's the number of times he was on the cover of a New York tabloid in just 15 years. From his real estate deals to his very public divorce, he was everywhere. And this was not an accident, it was completely by design. He figured out a fundamental truth about modern fame. Attention is everything. It didn't matter if the story was good or bad. As long as people were talking about him, he was winning. For him, any press was good press.
And if you want to know just how far he would go to control the story, get this. He would sometimes call reporters himself, but he'd pretend to be a fictional publicist named John Barron or John Miller, and he'd plant all these positive stories about Donald Trump. He even admitted to using the alias in court. It was just a totally brazen way to write his own narrative.
Okay, so how does all of this, the killer instinct from his dad, the aspirational brand he built, his mastery of the media, how does that all translate to actually being president? Well, it created a style of governing that was, to put it mildly, unlike any other.
Here's a perfect snapshot of what that looked like. One morning, he posts on Truth Social about the stock market. Then, just a few hours later, out of nowhere, he announces a 90-day pause on tariffs. This was a huge policy shift that apparently blindsided his own staff, who then had to scramble to figure out how to make it happen. Policy was literally being made in real time and broadcast directly to the world.
And that's because, when you boil it down, the presidency became the ultimate performance. Signing executive orders wasn't just a task, it was a staged event with these huge stacks of folders and his signature Sharpie. His rallies weren't just for campaigning, they were a tool to completely dominate the weekend news cycle. The brand, the image of power and success, often seemed way more important than the fine print of policy.
So when you piece it all together, the fighter who was taught to be a killer, the showman who sold a fantasy, and the president who governed by instinct and social media, it leaves you with a really big question. What does the Trump phenomenon reveal about this wild intersection of media, celebrity, and power in the world we live in today? That's definitely something worth thinking about.